So onto the evidences. This is part one, which is to do with mysteries of the Cambrian explosion. And this is in response to the first line of evidence for common descent from fossil record. So this is Darwin's Great Tree of Life. And this is the only illustration in Darwin's book called The Origin of Species. And in it, Darwin shows how a single species, if subjected to different environmental conditions over a geological time, can diverge into different forms or different species. So let's look at species A, for instance. You can see that if this species diversifies, it will, and Darwin has shown that it will be branched into various subspecies. Here he is shown 8 branches labeled as little a, little d, little s, I, k, l, and m. So what Darwin felt is that if this process were to continue over many generations, then over a course of millions of years, this single ancestral species can diverge into different species, genus, family, order, class, and even phyla. Now keep this point in mind, as I will come back to this later. If all animals were descended from a common ancestor, what would be expected in the fossil record? So the logic is that we would expect a long accumulation of minor differences that should appear first in large number of transitional forms at the level of species or genus or family, even order, followed by major differences that appear last in the fossil record at the level of phyla, or even above taxonomical levels such as kingdom, domain, and life. So we have slight differences at the level of species, followed by major differences at the level of phyla. You will not have a fossil record appearing the other way around, where major differences appear first, followed by slight differences. Slight differences will always be noticed in the fossil record before the major differences. So to illustrate that this expectation of Darwin does not work in favor of his theory, I have chosen these 7 major animal phyla to illustrate the problem that the tree of life faces. So on top left, you can see, so you can see 7 different major group phyla here, which are groups that are radically different in terms of their body structures. So on top left, you can see Platyhelminthes, which are flatworms. Then you can see next to them Nematoda, which inhabit in soil and ocean floor. And then you can see Echinodermata and so forth, all the way down to Annelida. And according to Darwin's theory, these phyla should arise last in the fossil record after the small differences. So according to this logic here, you have slight differences followed by major differences. So in the fossil record, the expectation of Darwin's theory is that these phyla should appear last. And most certainly they should not appear fully formed as you can see in these pictures. Now here is a schematic drawing of what we should be expecting in Darwin's theory. So these are major groups known as phyla that should arise over a long period of time through a long series of intermediate forms, as indicated in the red circles in the Precambrian period here, from a common ancestor. So if fossil record were giving us an accurate Darwinian picture, what we would expect is something like this, where in Precambrian there is going to be transitional fossils, and then there should be minor differences that lead up to the major differences that we see at the phyla level, which is at the Cambrian period. But what do we find? We find something that's strikingly different in the fossil record. Virtually all these 7 phyla appear fully recognizable and fully formed at about the same time without any precursors. So there is no complex multicellular ancestral forms that predate these 7 phyla. So Darwinian evolution's expectation was to have transitional fossils in the Precambrian. However, the fossil record is showing us that in Precambrian there is no complex multicellular ancestral forms. there is no transitional forms. And the question then is, where is the overwhelming evidence that permits no other conclusion, as Odesek and Bias had stated in their textbook? We only find microorganisms and things like stromatolites, which are single-celled organisms in Precambrian, but you do not find complex multicellular forms that can be linked to the phyla, the 7 phyla that has suddenly appeared in the fossil record. So here we have theory versus fact. According to neo-Darwinian understanding, the common ancestry is fact of evolution. However, we look at the model, instead of gradual branching tree picture proposed by Darwin that led up to a complex multicellular and diverse animal groups known as phyla that appear at the top, what we actually have that looks like a lawn or an orchard with major groups appearing suddenly fully formed and fully recognizable without any precursors that lead up to it, the common ancestor, universal common ancestor. So theory versus fact. Fact is there is no precursors. Theory that there should be transition forms from the common ancestor up to the 7 phyla. Now Darwin himself knew about this and he considered it a serious problem for his theory. And he states in his book on the origin of species that there is another and allied difficulty which is much more serious. So he considered this a serious difficulty. What is the difficulty? He goes on further explaining, I allude to the manner in which species belonging to several of the main divisions of animal kingdoms suddenly appear in the lowest known fossiliferous rocks. And this is the Cambrian period he's referring to, where the 7 phyla suddenly appear without precursor forms in fossil record that leads up to the common ancestor. And on the next book of his book, on the origin of species, he states, the case at present must remain inexplicable and may be truly urged as a valid argument against the views here entertained. So Darwin acknowledges that this could be truly urged as a valid argument against his theory. And he is unable to explain or account for this difficulty because there is no fossil record to show that there is a transition or small slight modifications that go up to the common ancestor. And then he goes on to saying, to show that it may hereafter receive some explanation, I will give the following hypothesis. So what is the hypothesis giving? He's saying, he according to his thoughts, the problem will just go away with fossil hunting. In the future, there'll be more fossil collecting, and that will cause the problem to go away. And if it didn't go away, then he argues, have we any right to assume that things have thus remained from the beginning of this world? In other words, he's saying, Precambrian fossils did not fossilize, so we do not have a right to assume the fossil record must be complete, because instead of having those fossils, the probability is that fossil record is incomplete because they were too delicate to be fossilized. So for Darwin, the very nature of fossil collection prevented us from getting to the truth. Yet neo-Darwinists, they believe that there is overwhelming evidence. So how does this add up? So here we have two main arguments given by the neo-Darwinists regarding the lack of fossil record that fits the theory. So firstly, they say fossil record is incomplete and flawed. So the argument is that the common ancestors do actually exist because Darwin's theory tells us they exist. However, these ancestors did not leave their fossils. And the reason why they did not leave their fossils is because they were washed away or deformed, or due to heat, they were destroyed and so forth. So the record became flawed. Therefore, we don't have those fossils. So the second argument they give is that fossils of ancestors may have been too small or delicate to have fossilized. So Darwin's tree of life tells us that there are fossils there, but they were too small or delicate to have fossilized in the first place because the size and delicacy did not permit them to be preserved during the Precambrian. But the problem with both of these arguments is that future fossil collecting have proven both of these arguments wrong. Moreover, the problem has actually accentuated for Darwinism. First of all, argument number one, the fossil record is flawed or incomplete. So the first counter-argument to this Darwinian excuse is that many Precambrian fossils do actually exist and have been found. Certainly, I'm not saying that the fossil record is complete, but it's complete enough, as many experts believe, that we can draw an accurate picture from the Precambrian to Cambrian period. So to say that the fossil record is incomplete itself is an invalid argument, because we have record before the Cambrian period. Secondly, the Cambrian explosion is now well documented from several locations. For example, most recently from China, where fossils are unusually well preserved. And the problem has become far more acute, wide, extensive, and the Cambrian explosion has become more sudden and explosive than it was previously thought. And this is known in biology as biology's Big Bang, because we have suddenly a lot of fossils being found at phyla level, which cannot be explained through a successive transition. So let's look at what an expert has to say about the Cambrian explosion. So here's a quote from James Valentine and his colleagues, taken from an article published in 1991. And they write Cambrian explosion is real, and it is too big to be mistaken by flaws in the fossil record. So the fossil experts who study the Cambrian fossils are inclined to believe that the explosion is actually real, and we cannot do away with it just by these two excuses which are presented in previous slide. So Valentine, he's not an ordinary scientist. He's someone who's written books, and also he's got a book on Cambrian explosion specifically. And he was a professor at University of California and studied these fossils for many years. So the argument is that the fossil record is incomplete and flawed itself is flawed. Now on to the second argument related to lack of fossil evidence for Darwin's tree of life. The argument here is fossils of ancestors were too small and delicate to have fossilized. So the counter arguments are three here. Firstly, we now have fossils that are known as microfossils that are found, and they are only visible under microscopes. And these were fossils that existed billions of years before Cambrian explosion. So small Precambrian fossils have actually been found, and they're far smaller than what has been found in the Cambrian period, which are the fossils of the 7 different phyla that I showed earlier. Secondly, many Precambrian fossils have been discovered that are soft-bodied. So this undermines neo-Darwinist argument that delicate fossils may not have fossilized. If that was true, then the fossils that are soft-bodied, which have been found before the Cambrian period in the Precambrian, would not have been found if that argument had any validity to it. And thirdly, it turns out that approximately 70% of fossils in the Cambrian explosion itself are soft-bodied. Now that's a significant percentage, 70%. So to argue that the soft-bodied fossils do not fossilize is by far incorrect, because 70% of fossils were soft-bodied within the Cambrian period itself. So the idea that animals were delicate and were unable to be fossilized does not stand up to the scrutiny, and neo-Darwinist argument here appears to be flawed. So let's see what an expert has to say about delicacy and small size of Precambrian fossils. We have here James Sharp. He is a geologist, another expert on the phenomena of Cambrian explosion. And he said in 1994, the long-held notion that Precambrian organisms must have been too small or too delicate to have been preserved in geological materials is now recognized as incorrect. So the Cambrian explosion is real phenomena, and the argument that Precambrian organisms were too small and delicate is a weak argument, according to these experts. So how do biology textbooks deal with this problem? So firstly, they either ignore it, which is for the most part, And you can look up in the index or even in the chapters on the history of life, and you'll find no mention of Cambrian explosion at all. Because it's a difficult problem, textbooks just leave it out for the convenience. Or a few textbooks do actually attempt to explain the discrepancies between Darwin's theory and the fossil record, but this is usually based on one or two lines of explanations and is to undermine the significance of fossil explosion rather than to face it and say that this is a real problem and it needs explanation. So as Darwin explained, this problem still remains inexplicable, and the textbook writers are unable to explain or account for this difficulty. Here's a textbook that tries to explain why Cambrian explosion doesn't actually affect Darwin's theory. And this is a postgraduate book, as I mentioned earlier, by Futuyma on evolutionary biology. So coming back to the point, either the textbooks ignore the problem or they try to explain away the significance of the Cambrian explosion. And not all textbook writers are as honest as I quoted James Valentine and his colleagues or William Shopt. These guys, they saw that within their fields of research, the record and the evidence is not matching. So they came out as honest scientists and confessed to that. But the textbook writers, they tend to present these theories as well evidenced, and they will not present those parts of the argument which have weaknesses in it. And Cambrian explosion causes a lot of difficulty for Darwinian evolution, so it's best left as not mentioned. So here we have people who have studied the Cambrian explosion again, and this is a renowned scientist, Professor Harry Whittington, and he's well known for his pioneering work on the study of Burgess shell fossils, which is fossils from Cambrian explosion. And Stephen Jay Gould has popularized his idea of Burgess shell fossils in his book called Wonderful Life. And he was a brilliant scientist, and he was a leading expert in the world on trilobites up until his death in 2010. And what he writes in his 1984 book is on the Burgess shell. He writes, "I look skeptically upon diagrams that show the branching diversity of animal life through time and come down at the base to a single kind of animal." So clearly what we see here is a world-renowned scientist who studies these fossils, doubting in the tree of life hypothesis, which neo-Darwinists hold on to very tightly. And he feels animals may have originated more than once in different places at different times. Now, this is very unlike Darwin's theory, which postulates that we all came from last universal common ancestor, all life, including the three domains of life. And here we have a world-renowned scientist who's not a creationist, neither were James Valentine and William Shopt, which I mentioned earlier. And these non-creationist scientists who are just being honest about evidence and what it entails in their respective fields of study. And they find that, and are quite frank about it, that the evidence and the theory do not match. And they make these statements, which then come out in public. Now, I gave two examples of how textbooks deal with the problem earlier. There are those who ignore the problem, and there are those who try to explain the problem away. So those textbooks which tries to explain the evidence of Cambrian explosion by undermining its significance or by showing alternative approaches to explaining how the Precambrian may have connected to the Cambrian period, they resort to what's called molecular comparisons. So this is one way defenders of Darwin's theory explain Cambrian fossil evidence. And the logic of molecular comparison is, if we look at the DNA in modern organisms and compare it, the more differences we find between two animals, presumably the more distantly related they are. So keep in mind that these molecular studies are only dealing with existing animals in our modern time. So these are modern organisms from which they extract DNA and do molecular studies. And they're not dealing with Cambrian or pre-Cambrian fossils, because those were fossils that were as old as 400, 540 or even a million years or even older. And DNA decays over such a long time. So DNA cannot be extracted and analyzed beyond, according to one estimate, beyond 6 million years. And the most oldest DNA that's probably been analyzed is no more than 800,000 years. So here we're dealing with a very long geological period, 540 million years ago. So that DNA cannot be extracted. So we're dealing with modern organisms from which DNA has been extracted and then subjected to molecular comparison studies. So what these molecular studies do, they extrapolate backwards to a common ancestor using some mathematical rules. So here I'm displaying the 7 major phyla again. And this time what I've done is labeling them with numbers, because I'll show you how molecular comparison studies work. So scientists, they take DNA samples from these modern animal phyla and extrapolate backwards to try to find patterns of the history of life. And that pattern should end up at the universal common ancestor according to Darwinian evolution. Here is the first thing that we notice when we construct an evolutionary tree based on molecules. We see a discrepancy. So on the left side, you can see a morphological tree, and on the right side, you've got molecular tree. These are known as phylogenetic trees. This is taken from a study performed in 1999 by Anna Marie and her colleagues, and this was published in American Zoologist. So you can see that the morphological structure, the phylogenetic trees that are constructed based on morphological structure do not match the phylogenetic trees based on the molecule known as 18S ribosomal RNA. So let me just point out the points of conflict here. On the left, you've got Platyhelminthes and Nematoda, which are labeled as 1 and 2 here, being grouped together as close relatives. And then if you construct a tree based on the molecules, what you will find is the Arthropoda and Nematoda being grouped together as labeled as 6 and 2 here. So remember, these lines, these white lines, are just extrapolations from the evidence, that they are not the evidence itself. The evidence is just where the numbers are. So what we would expect is that if these trees are accurate, then if we add more molecules, then that should refine the tree and make it more in sync with the morphological tree. So let's see another study here, which is based on 2 different molecules. So we've got on the left side 18S ribosomal RNA molecule being used to construct a phylogenetic tree. And on the right side, we've got 28S RNA molecule, which is being used to also construct a phylogenetic tree. And this is taken from a 1991 study which used molecular comparisons between 2 different ribosomal RNA molecules. So the point I'm making here is that by using 2 different molecules, the problem does not improve. We still have a problem persisting of inconsistencies between 2 trees. So on the left side, you got Mollusca and Annelida, which is labeled as 2 and 5 grouped together. And you got Echinodermata going off by themselves as labeled as 3. Whereas on the right side, you can see Echinodermata grouped with Mollusca, labeled as 3 and 5, and Annelida going off by itself on a separate branch. Now, if these phylogenetic trees yielded accurate results, then we should not have such discrepancies in phylogenetic trees between 2 different molecules. So perhaps someone may argue that this is just a sampling error, and these are not molecules. These are not enough molecules being used to construct the tree. So the more molecules we add, or even the same molecule, will give us consistent results. So what we find surprising is that if we take 2 studies here we've taken two studies, which one from 1998, another from 1995, using exactly the same molecule, which is 18S ribosomal RNA. Now, if you give this molecule to two different labs, you will still find conflicts. So on the left side, you've got Anna Marie's study, and on the right side, you've got Brigitte et al. And you see that there is discrepancies. It's the same molecule being used to construct phylogenetic trees, but the tree that's being constructed is variable. So what we have on the left side is Arthropoda and Nematoda being grouped together. And on the right-hand side, you've got Nematoda and Platyhelminthes being grouped together. So I'm referring to 6 and 2 being grouped together on this tree here, and then 6 and 5 being grouped together, whereas 2 has gone off by itself on another branch. So this shows that there is inconsistencies between trees based on the same molecule, even if that same molecule is given to two different laboratories. Then there is no way that we can reasonably argue from these phylogenetic trees that the mysteries of Cambrian explosion are not real and molecular comparison studies has a solution. So how do we have overwhelming body of evidence that permits no other conclusion when these trees are just contradicting amongst themselves? Here, I'm quoting a scientist who summarized the problem a few years ago. His name's Michael Lynch. He's a geneticist, and he writes, clarification of the phylogenetic relationships of the major animal phyla has been an elusive problem, with analysis based on different genes and even different analysis based on the same genes yielding a diversity of phylogenetic trees. So the diversity of phylogenetic trees is a problem which still persists till today. When you use these molecules, you cannot construct exactly the same trees because there is subjectivity to the molecular comparison studies. So the evidence is all over the place here. And it's not a fact that these animals share a common ancestor, as neo-Darwinists believe, because we have several discrepancies in these molecular studies, which shows that had the common ancestry model been true, then discrepancies will go away with adding more molecules. But here we've seen that that doesn't happen. So I'll give you a moment to read through the summary to this part, which is on Cambrian explosion, inshallah.